Hello and welcome to Rod Pumping Diagnosis and Optimization. My name is Sean Dawsey and I will be your instructor in this course, and it is my honor. And I'll be hanging out with you down here in the bottom of the slides as I guide you through the material. And I have good news for you, my friend. This is actually version 3.0 of this course, which means that this is my third time to go through the material and re-record the different sections. And each time I've gone through the course, I've improved the slides. I've also improved my delivery of the material, and as you can imagine, my comprehension of the material is much greater. But you should have seen some of the first versions of the recordings. It's actually a little bit embarrassing. I was camera shy, and I was even afraid to look you in the eyes. I was kind of looking down here a lot. But anyways, the course is greatly improved, and you're going to love it. So let me tell you quickly the genesis of this course. So it was 4.5 years ago. And my work was a little bit slow. So I'm a contractor. My work is really busy. Sometimes it's slower. And I was talking to my brother, and he said, well, if you have so much free time, why don't you make an online class for that topic that you're so passionate about? And I thought, wow, make an online class, that's crazy. Do you know how much time that would take? And initially I said no, but it was eating at my mind. And after about a week, I decided, you know what? I am going to make an online class, and it's going to take a lot of work. And here we are 4.5 years later, finally at the finish line. But anyways, enough about me. Let's focus on you. So why should you take this course? What is the value of this course? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to learn how to maximize the profitability of our wells by understanding the downhole conditions and using that to make educated optimization decisions. So what are we going to do? We're going to understand the downhole conditions. We have two diagnostic tools that we're going to go into depth on: our fluid level gun and our dynamometer system. By understanding what's happening downhole and tying in that information with our knowledge of rod pumping systems, we can make educated decisions, optimization decisions to extend run life, but also to maximize the profitability of our wells. So if we understand what's happening downhole, if we understand how rod pumping systems work, we can maximize the profitability of our wells. And that is what we are going to do. So in this course, I am going to open up the full extent of rod pumping wisdom to you. Now, I've been studying rod pumping systems intensively for the last 15 years, and I've boiled the most important information down into this course, which is about a 55-hour course. And you might be thinking, well, that's a very long course. It is too long. Well, it's not 15 years long. So I'm giving you all the highlights that I have learned as I've been studying these sort of systems. And again, already on the second slide, I have more good news for you. And this time it comes from the great Thomas Paine. So when you're thinking about the extent of this course or how long it is, keep this quote right here in mind. So the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. The harder you have to work at something, the greater it's going to be when you overcome it. And I promise you, if you go through this whole course and you take notes and you pay attention, you actively want to learn, you're going to end up way ahead of your peers in understanding rod pumping systems. It's going to be a fantastic course. So before we move on, let me tell you a little bit about myself and where I come from so you understand my background. So I graduated from Texas A&M University in 2009 with a degree in petroleum engineering. Texas A&M, they have a good petroleum engineering department, and the university is located about an hour north of Houston, Texas, if you're not familiar with it. But after graduation, I moved out west to Midland, Texas, and I began working for a small company named Discovery Operating. So this is a small family-run oil company. They've been around for about 50 years, and they had 350 wells scattered across the Permian Basin, and I really enjoyed my experience at Discovery Operating. And one of the best things about it is that it was a small company. And when you work for small companies, they say you wear a lot of hats, so you get exposed to lots of different facets of the industry. And I remember when I first graduated, they basically just threw me out in the field. You know, you learn a lot of theory in university, but go see how things actually work. So as soon as I graduated, I was out running around with roustabouts, building wellheads, working on tank batteries, and then I was riding around with pumpers, doing the normal routes, checking wells, checking pump action, gauging tanks. And then they threw me out on a pulling unit when I didn't even know what I was doing, and I was supposed to be supervising the job. So for example, for rod parts, tubing leaks, just kind of mundane type of work like that. But of course, very fascinating to actually see, how do you pull the equipment out? What does the equipment actually look like? And so, of course, I was mostly working in the office later on, managing production, managing pumpers, field personnel, that sort of thing. But I never lost contact with the field. So a lot of the work would be writing up a procedure, whether that would be something on a drilling rig or maybe hunting and squeezing off a casing leak, that sort of thing. But writing up a procedure and then going out into the field and actually supervising it. So early on in my career, as soon as I graduated and I started working for Discovery Operating, I knew I wanted to apply myself. Okay, I've always been a hard worker, and I wanted to advance my knowledge in my career. So I started studying rod pumping systems, and the reason I did that is that most of the wells we had produced by rod pump. So I started studying everything I could on rod pumping systems on the nights and on the weekends. So reading any papers, books, literature, talking with people in the industry. And I distinctly remember at about 2 years after doing that, I was sitting in the library in downtown Midland in the petroleum section and reading some literature, and it was boring to me because I already knew this material. I've already read this material a ton of times, and I knew all about it. And I was thinking, why am I sitting in here in the library? I'm in Midland, Texas. I work for an oil company. We have some wells that are 15 miles south of here. Why don't I go make the field my library? Why don't I go start studying from the wells and see how they actually act? So I talked my company into buying the diagnostic tools from Ecometer, the fluid level gun and dynamometer system, and then I tried to make the field my library and started messing around with the wells, trying to understand how they work. And I learned a lot in the process when it comes to various different things, but for example, failure reduction or pump spacing or mitigating gas interference, and started applying some of that and had great success. And eventually the operator made me the production manager for the last 2 years that I worked there. So I worked there for 5 years total. In 2014, I became a professional petroleum engineer, which means I took a hard competency exam and passed, and now I could be, for example, an expert witness, but have a little bit more credibility when it comes to the industry. More importantly, though, in 2014, this is when I started my company, Downhole Diagnostic. So if you look at my logo here, which you're going to see all throughout the course, this is the Dyno King. And this is kind of a play on the fact that dynamometer cards are called dyno cards. And so this is the Dyno King, representing the fact that my company is the king of dynamometer cards, or in dynamometer card interpretation. Now also, when you look at my company name and you look at the font here, Downhole Dia, notice we have a different font for Gnostic. Now why did I do that? I did that very intentionally. If we look at the etymology here of my company name, Downhole Diagnostic, Dia means through. And Gnostic means wisdom, but it actually means a little bit more than just wisdom. If you look at the first century Christian sects known as the Gnostics, Gnostic actually implies, it has a connotation kind of esoteric or mystical type of wisdom, or wisdom kind of from a higher spiritual place. And I like to think that I'm using that as I help customers to understand what is happening downhole and to put that into context. Now, how do I have that deep esoteric understanding of what's happening downhole? Well, that is what we're going to learn about in this course. We have two diagnostic tools. We have the fluid level gun that is looking down the annulus. We can see where the top of the fluid level is, if there's additional production potential, also what our bottom hole pressures are, and then our dynamometer test is looking down the rod string, and based on the shape of the downhole pump card and how the fluid load is picked up at the start of the upstroke and how the fluid load is released, or how the fluid load is released. Based on this, we can determine what condition the pump is in, but also what condition it is operating in. And this would indicate right here that we have fluid pound due to incomplete liquid fillet. And we will talk all about the tools in this course, and hopefully by the end of it, you will have the same sort of insight and knowledge of these tools, how to apply them, and how to apply the data that you're getting back from them when we understand the downhole conditions. So before we move on, I just want to say that this course is copyright protected. I poured my heart and soul into this course over the last 4.5 years, and I did 100% of the work myself. So please do not copy, share, reproduce, or rip me off in any way. I would greatly appreciate it. So please support a small business. Talk about the ultimate small business. I'm a one-man company, and you would not believe the labor of love that I've put into this course, trying to perfect it and make it as great as it is. So also, this course is designed to be computer-based. So it is designed for you to be sitting there at a computer. And if you're sitting at a computer, the size of the font and the size of the images should be adequate. Okay, it is not designed to be watching this course on some sort of projector. Again, if you're going to buy access to this course, I would appreciate one access code for one person, not buying it for a whole company and watching it on some sort of projector. Please support me. I would greatly appreciate it. Also, you can try to watch this course on your phone. It's probably not going to go too well. Everything is going to be too small, but if you want to watch a section on the computer, and then maybe you're bumping down a lease road driving to the wells and you want to re-listen to it and maybe look at the small images on your phone as you're driving out on the highway, something like that, you can go for it, but it is designed for you to be sitting at a computer. So now let's talk about the topics of this course. What are we going to discuss? Well, the first question is, what are the goals of the course? Well, I mentioned it on the first slide, but really we have these surface tools that we can use. For example, a fluid level gun, or we have dynamometers. You might even have permanent automation on your well. All of them are getting data as to what is happening downhole. And once we get that data, if we can put it into context, we can make better decisions as to how we want to operate this particular well to maximize its production and ideally to minimize the expenses associated with this well. Because if you can maximize the production, minimize the expenses, you are then going to maximize the profitability of that well. We want to make educated decisions, but in order to make an educated decision, you have to have some information to base that decision on. These are the tools that let us look downhole, and this is what we're going to focus on to a large degree. What information come from these tools and how we integrate that with the whole rod pumping system to understand what is occurring so we can optimize our particular well. Now, here are the topics that we are going to go into depth on in this course. We're going to look at rod pumping systems, kind of everything about a rod pumping system. We're going to go into deep detail on fluid level shots and dynamometer tests. We have a section dedicated to gas interference and solids separation, so to separate those out, and then if you can't, how to properly handle those with your pump design. We're going to look at automation, a pump-off controller. That's what this is right here, and it's integrated into a variable speed drive. So if you just have a pump-off controller, it will shut the well down if the pump fillage drops. If you integrate that with a variable speed drive, then you can slow the strokes per minute down if the pump fillage drops. But this is automation that's reacting based to what the dynamometer cards look like. We're going to talk about different types of rods, rod grades, how rods are manufactured. We're also going to look at specialty equipment to extend run life. So if you have lots of rod on tubing wear, what can you install that's going to extend the run life for that particular well? And all throughout this course, we're going to be looking at troubleshooting wells. So if a well is not acting right, okay, trying to determine what is the cause of the problem, why is it underperforming? Well, we're going to talk about that all throughout the course. Also optimizing. Okay, so once we get data from the well, what is the best way to run this well? A lot of times optimization is quite clear. If you have gas interference, what is optimization? Well, that means improving your downhole gas separation design to try and remove that gas interference. But we will focus on this all throughout the course. And the focus of the training is going to be on echometer equipment. And you might be thinking, well, I don't have echometer equipment, and so this course is not appropriate for me. That is not the case. Okay, when you look at a fluid level shot, no matter what device is getting that data, it is going to have the same principles when it comes to interpretation. That is the same thing when it comes to the dynamometers. These are both echometer dynamometers, meaning that they are temporary install dynamometers. But if you have another device from another company, well, a dynamometer card, as long as it's drawing correctly, is a dynamometer card. So it does not matter what device you're using. We're also going to look at dynamometer cards and the differences between how they draw on POCs versus the cards that come off of the echometer system. But we will focus on echometer equipment. You will see pictures of it. And echometer dominates the US market. It also probably dominates the international market when it comes to fluid level systems and temporary install dynamometers. They have fantastic equipment, and even better, they have better software. Their software is amazing. So we're going to focus on rod pumping systems in this course. You might have got that hint from the name of the course, but I realize that some people are probably coming to this course because they're really just interested in fluid level shots. So the fluid level gun, you can take a fluid level shot essentially down any type of well. As long as there's not fluid to surface on both sides, you can shoot down either the tubing or the casing. Now, you might not have rod pumping wells, and that's okay, because when we talk about fluid level shots, I will show you examples from gas lift and ESP and other forms of artificial lift, and really the principles of interpreting a fluid level shot and how it calculates the distance to the fluid level. It's going to be the same whether you have a rod pumping well or a gas lift well or any form of well. But we are going to focus on rod pumping systems specifically because we're going to be talking about dynamometer tests as well, and this is specific only to rod pumping wells. And also in this course, there's going to be lots of pictures. As you can see, all of these pictures are pictures that I've acquired over the last 10 years. And so there's going to be lots of good examples to illustrate what I'm talking about. If I don't have a picture of my own, I got something from the literature and the industry, or I made diagrams to illustrate my point. There's lots of great examples. So as I've been working for myself for the last 10 years, and as I've encountered interesting types of wells, I've been recording those wells and kind of keeping track of them, not necessarily knowing what I was using it for, kind of as a backup reference. But you're in luck because a lot of those interesting examples have been included in this course. And also the information in this course is going to be practical. We're not going to go deep into a lot of theory or equations. It's going to be straightforward. We have a couple equations, one that repeats over and over and over again, and it's the simplest equation in the world. The fluid load equals the pressure differential times the area. We will see that one a lot, but the information will be practical. We're not going to go deep into theory unless it's absolutely necessary, but it's all going to be information that you can take and quickly apply in your operations. So what is the target audience for this course? Well, I would say anyone who is operating wells. So if you work for an oil company and you're operating wells, this is a good course for you. If you're using the echometer equipment, especially, or any sort of fluid level gun and dynamometer system, if you're interpreting fluid level and dynamometer tests, maybe you don't actually acquire it, somebody in the field does, but it comes to your desk and they ask you, what does it mean? This is a great course for you. And if you're interfacing with the automation, the pump-off controllers and variable speed drives out in the field, which we can see right here in this image. This is actually the pump-off controller, and this is a pump-off controller integrated into the variable speed drive. But in order to understand these systems, how to set them up, how to program them, how to troubleshoot them, we're going to talk all about it. So it's a good course for you. So I would say anybody who is a well technician, this is somebody that we would typically define as doing fluid level shots and dynamometer tests. Obviously, this is going to be a great course for you. This is what I do for a living. I've been doing it the last 10 years. If you're a foreman, you're managing a bunch of field personnel, a bunch of wells, or even if you're an engineer in the office, this is going to be a fantastic course for you to understand the tools that you can use to diagnose your wells and optimize them. I would say if you're a pumper, this is a great course for you. A lot of the material might be higher level though, because you might not have as much training, but of course, if you want to advance in your career, you need to start taking on more knowledge. So a good class for you. And also if you work for a service company, or you're just a salesman, let's say you just sell downhole pumps, or you just sell sucker rods, this is going to be a fantastic course for you if you want to understand rod pumping systems and you want to be of more value to your customers. So I was talking with somebody that manufactures variable speed drives and pump off controllers. And he was saying, so he's kind of newer, I would say, to the industry. But anyways, people were asking him, what does this dynamometer card mean? How do you interpret this? Put this into context. And he was thinking, I don't necessarily know. I just manufacture the equipment that is drawing the dynamometer cards and it's regulating the strokes per minute. But I don't necessarily know how to interpret dynamometer cards. Well, again, you're going to get these sort of questions. The more information you have, the more value you're going to be to your customers. And in designing this course, it's hard to create a course because what sort of level am I speaking to? Am I speaking to beginners? Am I speaking to advanced people? Well, this course is designed for all levels of experience. So the way that I have laid this out is that on each particular topic, we're going to start with the basics. Okay, we're going to make sure we have a firm foundation to build on. And then from that point on, we are going to advance up to a high level, an advanced level. So I'm going to go through the basics. I will not dwell there too long. I would assume most people understand a lot of the basics of rod pumping systems, but I will briefly cover that, and then we're going to build up to a high level so I can try to kind of sweep everybody along with me as we progress through this course. Let's now look at the section outline for this course and the topics we're going to cover and in what order. There is a very detailed course outline that I've included, and it's going to go over every topic that we're going to discuss and in what order. So if you open that up, it should be right here below the video in the attachments. And if you scroll down, notice, for example, section 4, fluid level shots. Okay, it shows all the different topics we're going to go into, but notice over here, this is the video number. So if you wanted to skip ahead, for example, to the 3 methods for calculating the acoustic velocity, it would appear that that's going to show up here at the end of video 4.3 and then pick back up here in 4.4. So make sure you download this and print this, and you can use this as a reference as to what topics are coming up next. Now there's about 3 different groupings of sections for this course, and the first grouping is going to be kind of the introductory material. Right now we are in the introduction in section 1. Section 2 is going to be a rod pumping overview. This is going to be quite basic. And really, we're going to be looking at just kind of the basic components of a rod pumping system. And this is going to be more beginner style here. But just to make sure you have the terminology, you understand how everything links together, I want you to see what rods look like, steel rods, fiberglass rods. What is a pump off controller? How does it all link together? What in some of the key concepts, for example, downhole gas separation, that sort of thing. So I recommend you go through this. If you're more advanced, you're certainly welcome to skip that section. And then section 3, this is intro to optimization and fluid level and dynamometer test. I'm going to talk about what is optimization, different ways of thinking about that, what are we trying to achieve. And then here, I'm going to kind of whet your palate and get you prepared for the discussion of the fluid level and dynamometer sections that we're going to go into next. Now, let me just say, these are going to be short sections right here. So they're all about an hour long, so you can rapidly progress from 1 through 3. And then we get into kind of the meat and potatoes showing up here from section 4 to section 8. Now notice the color coding here. So we've got fluid level shots part 1, and then here's fluid level shots part 2. We have dynamometer surveys part 1 and dynamometer surveys part 2. So I broke it up into 2 different sections just so it's not too monotonous to stay on the same topic for too long. But let's look at what we're going to discuss in each section. So for fluid level shots part 1, we're going to look at the theory of fluid level shots, how they work. We're going to look at acoustic traces and the polarity of the kicks. We're going to look at the 3 different methods for calculating the acoustic velocity, and then we're going to focus on getting good shots, where you can actually identify a fluid level kick, and if you can't, ways that you can improve the clarity of your shot. After that, before we go to dynamometer surveys, we need to kind of lay the groundwork. And so we're going to do here in section 5, we're going to talk about downhole rod pumps and rod pump operation. So we're going to look at what are the components of a downhole rod pump, the traveling valve and standing valve and the barrel assembly and the plunger assembly. We'll look at different types of pumps, and also we're going to look at how the system operates with the fluid load being picked up on the upstroke, which causes rod stretch, and that puts the fluid load on the plunger. And then on the downstroke, the fluid load is transferred to the tubing. Your tubing will stretch. So we're going to focus really on some key aspects when it comes to rod pump operation, but kind of lay the groundwork and understand what downhole pumps look like, so that then in section 6, when we go to dynamometer surveys, we're ready for card interpretation. So in this section, we're going to start with the surface card. We're going to talk about the wave equation, and then we're going to look at every different permutation of downhole pump card. So any sort of different downhole pump card, at the end of this section, you should be pretty expert at interpreting these types of cards. At the very end of the section, we will discuss different types of load cells and the differences that are created between those and the way that they draw dynamometer cards. Then we're going to go back to fluid level shots in section 7. And here we're going to look at filters for the acoustic trace to try and highlight the fluid level kick. Also filters for tubing collars. We're going to look at complicated fluid level shots. So if you have lots of repeats and it's hard to interpret what you're actually looking at, we will look at some of those examples. And we will look at bottom hole pressure calculations, both producing and static, and that will tie into the inflow performance relationship, which is a way to predict the maximum deliverability or production from a particular well. Then we will go back to dynamometer systems. So in part 2 right here, we're going to look at rod loading. Then we're going to look at valve test, which is a way to quantify the amount of slippage that is occurring between the plunger and barrel assembly. We're going to look at the different causes of downhole friction, the viscous friction, and also rod-on tubing drag friction. We're going to look at reference load lines, which are helpful when it comes to troubleshooting wells. And then we're going to look at how a dynamometer card can approximate what the pump intake pressure is. Typically, we're calculating the pump intake pressure from a fluid level shot, but you can also approximate it from a dynamometer card, and this is pretty important to understand how it works and when it's accurate and when it's not accurate. So after that, we're going to go to the third grouping of sections right here. So with this, we've got the basis for our diagnostic tools and what they can tell us and how we can interpret what's happening downhole. And then we're going to build on top of that. So in section 9, this is Echometer software. We're going to run through the Echometer software. I will show you some tips and tricks, kind of how to work it, and probably a few things you don't know. In this course, we're going to be looking at the Echometer software. This is a free software you can download, and if you want to get good at it, you might skip to section 9 first before taking the rest of the course so you're familiar with how the software works. In section 10, we're going to talk about gas and solids. So we're going to talk about separating out gas and solids before they get into the pump intake with a gas separator or a desander. And then if you can't separate them out, what are some different components you can install for your downhole pump to better handle the gas and solids that are moving through the pump. Section 11 is going to be on automation and runtime control. So we'll look at wells that are running on timer. How do you appropriately set the timer? And then we'll upgrade that to pump off controllers, which are going to turn the well off if the pump fillage drops. And then you can integrate a pump off controller with a variable speed drive, which will then slow the well down, slow the strokes per minute down as the pump fillage is dropping. Section 12, this is a really bad name here, but other topics. And really what this section is about, it's got 4 topics in it, but primarily it's about chemical treatment, and it's also about pump action. So looking at the pressure gauge on the wellhead, on the tubing, and trying to understand what that is telling you. That's how a lot of pumpers interpret how the well is performing, is they look at the pump action, they're not looking at dynamometer cards. And then section 13, this is a fantastic section, quite interesting here. So I'm going to give you some general information, maybe tips and tricks on failure prevention when it comes to rods and tubing. And then we're going to look at specialty equipment to extend run life. So if you have deviated wells and you have lots of rod on tubing wear, what are some things you can do to extend run life? For example, running rod guides or running continuous rod, co-rod, or maybe you have polyline tubing or IPC tubing or boronized tubing, or maybe you have a tubing rotator. We're going to talk about all these different topics in this section. And at the end, this is basically the end of the course, and I have troubleshooting examples where I encountered something interesting at the well. I'm going to give you the data piece by piece, and hopefully by this point in the course, you can think about what information do we need or what test should we do to try and figure out what is the problem with this well. So hopefully after all of this knowledge, you can kind of follow along with me to figure out what we need to do before I give you the answer. And finally, we have the final quiz. Do not skip the final quiz. I highly recommend it. So it's about 5 hours long, but what is important about it is that I went back through all of the different sections, and if there was any important topics, I made a question out of it. So this is a way to test your knowledge, but also to have a final review on the most important concepts in this course. So before we move on here, let's talk about a few recommended references. Now this is one that you're going to see all throughout the course. You're going to see this abbreviation when I have references to different papers. This is the Southwestern Petroleum short course. So this is a symposium put on in Lubbock, Texas, which is about 2 hours north of Midland every year. And there's lots of papers that are being presented. There's like 8 different rooms and people are giving different presentations at the same time. And you kind of pick the topics that you're interested in and you can go listen to those presentations. But what's really great about this, if you contact them, go to their website, you can pay for the whole compendium of all the papers that have ever been presented. Last I checked, it was $300 to get that, and you will get PDF versions of every paper going back to 1954. It's broken down by year. And you can do keyword searches in those folders if you want to find something about rod guides, or if you want to find something about paraffin or friction, that sort of thing. You can do a keyword search and find all sorts of good information. This is why I have so many papers that come from this. This is my main resource to look things up. If I can't find it in a book or on the internet, I'm certainly looking right here. So also, if you want some good papers, you can go to Ecometer's website, and they have some of the best papers on rod pumping systems. Now, all the papers they write, they present here in Lubbock at the short course, but these right here you can get for free. So if you go to this link, they have lots of great papers. They have the diagnostic tools that are looking down the hole. And so the data they're getting back, you have to interpret it. To interpret it, you have to understand what's going on. They describe in great detail what's happening downhole in wells. So I highly recommend these. And lastly, this is a reference that comes from myself. So this is the first thing I made when I started my company. This is the sucker rod pumping short course. And you can see that I got some of the name here from the short course in Lubbock. This is a 6-page rod pumping brochure that has lots of, it's kind of a desk reference. It has lots of great information when it comes to rod pumping systems. For example, if you want to calculate production, or about downhole gas separation and the downward fluid velocity in your gas separator. So this is something you should print up and have on your desk as we go through this course. And sometimes in the course, you will see this pop up if I'm talking about an equation. For example, to calculate the production rate from a well, I can say sucker rod pumping short course page 1. That means the equation is here. You don't have to necessarily write it down. You can just go highlight it on this 6-page brochure. And 2 other references before we move on. My favorite rod pumping book is the Beam Lift Handbook by Balmer and Podio. It goes into everything related to rod pumping systems. It has great illustrations, fantastic information. It is by far the best out there on the market. And my second favorite book, this one is specific though to just fluid level shots. So you'd have to be somebody that's probably doing fluid level shots to maybe want this one, but it's also a fantastic book. This is by Podio and McCoy. Jim McCoy is the person that founded Ecometer. So this is Acoustic Fluid Level Measurements in Oil and Gas Wells Handbook. I highly recommend both of these books right here. Now, as we're going through the course, you might see some abbreviations. Also in that 6-page rod pumping brochure, you see that there's lots of abbreviations right here. Hopefully they're straightforward. For example, the traveling valve and the standing valve. But as we go through the course, you might see sentences like this. Okay, but what I'm going to try to do, as opposed to just say the TV is attached to the PGR, I'm going to try to read it out so you understand these abbreviations. It's abbreviated just to keep the slides a little bit cleaner so it doesn't get too wordy. But the traveling valve is attached to the plunger, and on the downstroke, the pump intake pressure is compressed to the pump discharge pressure. So if you look at this image, here is the pump intake pressure, the pressure of the fluid going into the pump. It goes into the pump chamber, and on the downstroke, the pressure in the pump chamber is increased, and that fluid is compressed to the pump discharge pressure, the pressure above your downhole pump. So if you look at the 6th page on that 6-page brochure, it has a list of abbreviations if you need it for that brochure. Also for this course, there is an abbreviation list included in the attachments. You can save it. I don't think you're going to need it. As I mentioned, I'm going to try to spell this out as I read it off the slide, and eventually you'll get very familiar with these. I tried to make the abbreviations as obvious as possible. Also in this course, we are going to be looking at some TAM example files. So TAM is a software package from Ecometer. You can download it for free from their website. It comes with some course examples, and TAM stands for Total Asset Management. I've also included some examples that we're going to discuss in the class together. And if you download those, you can upload those into TAM. So for example, an example well file in there is the fluid level at surface, TAC is packed off. If you import the files into TAM, the default folder it is going to import them into is going to be this little up caret electronic sucker rod pumping dash downhole diagnostic examples. You can also import it into a different folder name if you want. Now, the version of TAM that I am currently using right now is version 1.8.56. If you try to incorporate the example files that I've attached here to the course, and it's not working, you might have to update your TAM version if you have an older software version. So if you look at TAM, if you open it up in the bottom left corner, it says Utilities. You click that button, a box will pop out, and at the bottom it says About. If you click About, it's going to tell you what version of the software you have, and you can verify. It should also tell you if your version is up to date. So if you have an older version and the files aren't working, you should look to update your TAM. So that is the end of the introduction to this course, and if you want, you can skip ahead to section 2. What I'm going to talk about for the rest of this video is I'm going to discuss the Permian Basin, also the price of oil and how it affects our industry. So if you're not familiar with the Permian Basin, so this is where I live, right here in Midland, Texas. The Permian Basin consists of the southeast corner of New Mexico, and then also the western region of Texas. And it is a huge plot of land. This is where the organic rich material was deposited that ended up cooking into oil. And we have lots of activity going on right here. So if you look at this particular image, it shows blue. These are platforms, which means that these were higher elevation areas. And then you have the yellow here, which were basins, which means that they were lower depressed areas. And it might make a little bit more sense if I show you this image. So this is how they envisioned the Permian Basin looked. So the Permian Basin gets its name from the Permian geologic time frame, which was about, they estimate, 300 million years ago, but it was all underwater. Okay, so all of this was underwater, except you can see that that platform we're discussing, which we'll talk more about, the Central Basin Platform, is kind of jetting out. So this is a higher elevation area. This is all land right here. And the current theory for oil generation, how is oil generated? Well, it almost always seems to be that in some sort of ancient geologic time frame, all of the oil was located in areas that had bodies of water in them. So you had algae, or you had plankton, you had seaweed, you had other sea creatures that were living in the sea. And when they died, they fell down to the seabed, and sediments that are being carried off the land by rivers would eventually bury these organisms deeper and deeper into the ground. And with higher temperature and higher pressure, they eventually cook up to oil. And if you cook them longer, they will break, the hydrocarbon chains will break, and they will form into gas, natural gas. So you can see that we have the two basins right here. So the primary focus of development is right here, the Delaware Basin right here. Here's the Central Basin Platform, and then you have the Midland Basin. Now, the first well that was drilled in the Permian Basin was in 1923. Okay, that's 100 years ago. We just celebrated the 100-year anniversary, and this is the Santa Rita #1, and it was drilled in Big Lake, Texas, which is somewhere around here where my mouse is. It's about an hour and a half south of Midland. And of course, back in those days, you don't know if there's oil there until you start having oil blow out the derrick. What's interesting is that it took them 2 years to drill 3,000 feet. and they were averaging 5 feet per day as they drilled this particular well, and they were using cable tool drilling. So if you know what that is, that's where you have kind of like a big pick that you're picking up and you're dropping down and you're chipping away at the rock, and after you break up enough rock, you have to go down, bail it out to get it out of the way to start cutting up new rock. But it's not the modern rotary style drilling, so it took an extremely long time, but 100 years ago was the first commercially drilled well, and of course now we have wells scattered all over the Permian Basin. And I was recently reading some statistics which actually kind of blew my mind. So half of the U.S. production, or 5.3 million barrels of oil per day, is coming just from the Permian Basin. And this is shocking to me because we have lots of oil in the United States. So if we go back to the Permian Basin image right here, if we look up in the panhandle of Texas, there's oil production there. There's also oil in Oklahoma right above it, or there's oil here in the Eagle Ford. There's also oil right here along the Gulf Coast, and we have some prolific wells out in the Gulf of Mexico. There's lots of oil in Louisiana, or you can go all the way north to the top of the country to North Dakota and Montana. There's lots of oil there. If you go west to California, if their government still allows them to produce the oil, they have a lot of oil there. We have some very prolific wells in Alaska. And so even though we are just this one particular region and there's oil all over the United States, we are producing half of the United States production. What's also interesting is that 20% of the world's drilling rigs are currently operating in the Permian Basin. And this is a shocking statistic to me. Now, you could look at this in two different ways. It could be a positive thing, like look at how much activity there is, look at how much investment there is to developing the hydrocarbons out here in the Permian Basin, or you could look at this in a sad way. Okay, look at how much drilling they have to do to achieve this amount of production. Now, part of the reason there's so much drilling going on out here is because we have lots of shale plays. These are unconventional type reservoirs that are primarily being developed right here in the Delaware Basin, in the Midland Basin. And shale rock is basically just really crappy rock. So there's lots of oil in it. We just have a hard time of getting that oil extracted. And really, the only economic way of doing that is doing horizontal wells with long laterals. Currently, they're doing 2 to 3 mile laterals is kind of the typical now. But doing these long laterals and then cracking the rock open with a fracture job, so where you pump water at high pressure to crack the rock open, and then you pump in sand to try and keep that fracture open. And that fracture is kind of a highway for oil and gas that's far away from the wellbore so that it can migrate its way over to the well so it can be produced, because it cannot migrate its way through the rock, the shale rock, naturally. So it takes a lot of drilling in order to achieve that sort of production. That is the sad part about it, but people are making very economic wells at the current oil price doing this horizontal drilling in fracturing operations. Now, you don't want to overlook, so a lot of the activity or a lot of the focus nowadays in the Permian Basin is on the shale plays, the unconventional reservoirs where we're doing that sort of thing in the Delaware Basin, in the Midland Basin. But the Central Basin Platform is not something you want to overlook. So up to 45% of the production to date from the Permian Basin has come from the Central Basin Platform. And the reason for this being is that this is higher in elevation, so it's not as deep. You don't have to drill as deep to it, but also it has lots of carbonate type rock, and it has conventional type reservoirs, which means you can drill just a single vertical well, which can deplete a large area around it. So here's what a cross-section of the Permian Basin looks like. And again, we're going to be focusing here on the Delaware Basin, Central Basin Platform, and the Midland Basin, where most of the activity is. So if you look at the Central Basin Platform, these are the most common formations that people are producing. You can see they're higher in elevation. It is a platform, so it is higher than the sedimentary basins over here on the west and the east. And the most common formation, or probably most of the production has come from, is the San Andres, but we have these other formations that are also quite productive depending on where you're at. And especially here on the edge of these platforms, a lot of the oil that was generated down here that was able to migrate up dip, and it was trapped here in the Central Basin Platform in these more conventional type wells. Now, if we look at the Delaware Basin, okay, what people are drilling with the laterals and the big frac jobs, they're primarily going for the Bone Spring and the Wolfcamp. In the Midland Basin, what people are primarily going for is the Sprayberry and the Wolfcamp. You can see the Wolfcamp somehow kind of extends through both of these different basins here. And these are the zones that are primarily going for in those two particular basins. So we have the Avalon. Notice the Bone Spring, it's not just one single layer of the bone springs. We've got a bone spring first and second, and same thing with the Wolfcamp. We got a Wolfcamp A upper, Wolfcamp A lower, and so these are delineated into different benchmarks. Same thing here. If you skip over to the Midland Basin, we have the Sprayberry here and then the Wolfcamp with different benchmarks. And this kind of shows it nice and neat, kind of homogeneous layers. That's not actually how rock looks. So this is going to be a Wolfberry well. So if you had a vertical well that was producing both the Wolfcamp and the Sprayberry, they call this a Wolfberry if it's just a vertical well. But you can see from the logs, also from cores, when you take cores from the ground, it's not that it's all nice and neat and uniform. So here's some pictures of some random cores. I don't know where they came from. There's a lot of cores laid out at some symposium, which is kind of cool. But you can see all of the different layers of rock intermixed here that represent different depositional environments. And based on those depositional environments and the quality of that rock, that is going to affect the productivity and how easily fluid can migrate through. You can see some of this. This looks to be some sort of carbonate, and it's got some sort of inclusions. I don't know exactly what these are, some ancient shells, something like that, that were cut up in this core as it was brought out. But the rock downhole is just not nice and neat and uniform as you're seeing in these images right here. It's actually quite complex, and it depends on where you're drilling at as to what it's actually going to look like. So here's another cross section of the Permian Basin. So if you look at this map down here, the gray here, this is the Delaware Basin. Here's the Central Basin Platform in the Midland Basin. And the line that we are looking at is going here in red, and the star represents this rig right here. So the Delaware Basin, if you just look at it, you can see that the Delaware Basin actually is deeper than the Midland Basin. Okay, and this particular well right here is going down almost to the complete depth of it, down here to either the Atoka or the Morrow zone, and they have a TD of 17,800 feet, which is very deep. So if you're getting down here, you were getting into some sort of gas play. I don't normally see them producing down there. Of course, they're not normally rod pumping, so I might not be called out to these particular wells, but most companies are going for the Wolfcamp over here and also the Bone Springs. And if you had a vertical well producing those and you commingled it, we like to call that a wolf bone. And if you come over here to the Midland Basin, if you were producing the Sprayberry and the Wolfcamp, again, if you had a vertical well that was producing that commingled, we would call that a Wolfberry. And a lot of these shale plays companies were producing some of these commingled with just vertical wells, not doing the horizontal wells. This was probably early 2000s, but now almost everybody is doing the horizontal wells into them because they are much more economic, much more prolific due to the increased amount of contact with the reservoir. So if you look at a vertical well, again, here's an example where you have all of these different zones, and out here in the Permian Basin we call stacked pay, because you have lots of different zones that have oil content in it. And so if you do a vertical well, you might be opening up all of these different zones right here, as opposed to a horizontal well where you kick off in one particular zone and you have lots more contact with that one particular zone. And so you have a higher production rate due to the increased contact, as opposed to just having a single set of perforations across from these different zones. Depending on if you have a vertical well or a horizontal well, you're going to have different characteristics to the production from that particular well. And depending on who you are and where you operate, you might never see a horizontal well. All of your wells might be vertical, or if you're working out here in the Permian Basin, you might have some vertical wells that nobody cares about, kind of the legacy old wells that make 5 barrels of oil per day. And all of the new stuff you're bringing online is a horizontal well, and this is what you care about. So you have much more prolific wells that are maybe making 250 barrels of oil a day, so nobody really cares about that 5 barrel of oil per day well. So, but there are different characteristics, and let's just talk about a few of them here. So again, a lot of the older wells were all vertical. This is what we're going towards. But if you have all of these zones with the stacked pay, and let's say that you want to complete all of these zones, you might have a perforated interval that comes from the upper Sprayberry, and it goes all the way down here, say to the Strawn, or maybe even something lower. You could have a 2,000 to 3,000 foot perforated interval. And what's interesting about that is typically, or frequently I should say, we like to set the TAC above the top perforations so that we don't have solids stick to TAC. If it's below the perforations, it's more likely to get stuck. But if you have one of these vertical wells with that huge completion, you might have 2,500 feet of unanchored tubing. Also, it's going to be more difficult to see a fluid level kick. Okay, if the fluid level is down here below the TAC and below a lot of the perforations, when you take a fluid level shot, because that fluid level shot is going to reflect off the TAC, which is above the perforations, and then those perforations are going to reflect a lot of the energy back as well before it can get down to the fluid level. So sometimes it's hard to actually find where the fluid level is in these sort of completions. Also, with a vertical well, you should theoretically, in most circumstances, be able to have perfect gas separation because you can put the pump intake down below the bottom perforation. All of those characteristics I just described are not the same in a horizontal well. You cannot put the pump intake below the bottom perforation. That would be at the end of the lateral. Typically, you are setting that pump intake right there above the kickoff point, and the kickoff point is where it starts to curve down as it's going down into the horizontal right here. So you would set the pump right here. Maybe you set it a little bit down into the curve, and if you're brave or you really want to take the bottom hole pressure down lower, you might set it down at 60 degrees. But of course, you're going to have increased wear and failures as a result of that. So most people are setting it up here, and you're probably going to have your TAC right around your pump intake. And so it's usually not very difficult to get a good fluid level kick on it because we don't have all this other stuff sending reflections back. But when you have a horizontal, you might be getting periodic slugs, large volumes of gas that are unloading from the lateral coming by your pump intake. And you might see your pump fillage vary a lot as a result of that when big slugs of gas come up by your gas separator. So just differences between the different types of wells. We will discuss that, but always something to keep in mind when you're troubleshooting a well. Am I troubleshooting a vertical or is it a horizontal? There are different characteristics. Okay, so we're done talking about the Permian Basin, and what I want to focus on now is the price of oil and how that affects our industry. And as we'll talk about later on in this course, when we talk about optimization, optimization can mean different things during different times. If you have a really high price of oil, around $100 a barrel, optimization might be pushing your equipment hard, okay, risking failures to get additional production. And sometimes if the price of oil is quite depressed and low, optimization means do not burn cash. You don't want failures. Save money on electricity, save money on anything. We do not want to have any expenses right now. So it's very important to understand what economic environment you are in as you are operating wells. And as you can see in this chart, that is going to change quite a bit. So this is a chart of WTI, the price per barrel. That's West Texas Intermediate. And this is a 25-year chart. And I have a 1-month average on the data to smooth out some of that variability. So if you come down here to the timeline, this is the year 2000. You can see 2010 going up to 2024 when I'm recording this right now. And here's the price of oil. That's a little bit hard to see. So I have two little benchmarks right here. This is $50 a barrel and $100 a barrel. So when I first entered Texas A&M University, the price of oil was $54 a barrel. That was in 2004. You can see it was on a nice upswing right here. And when I first entered Texas A&M University, I actually went there to be an electrical engineer. I didn't necessarily know what I wanted to do, but my dad was an electrical engineer, and I thought that this would be a good, stable career path. But as I started to get into some of my upper level classes, I started kind of looking around at the other students sitting around me. It's like, these guys are kind of dorks. And I don't know if electrical engineering attracts these types of people or if it turns you into these types of people, but I think I should get out of here. So I was talking with a friend in one of my mechanical engineering classes, and he was from Qatar, and he said, you know what, you should look at petroleum engineering. And I thought, you know what, petroleum engineering sounds great. The world runs on oil. It's an important industry. And so I went into petroleum engineering somewhere around this time frame right here. Price of oil was historically high compared to where it had been. And I quickly thought that I was a genius because the price of oil skyrocketed up to this blow off top, up to around $139 a barrel here in the middle of 2008. Now, this is when everybody was talking about peak oil and that the price of oil was going to go up to $500 a barrel. We're never going to find any more oil. We're using too much. We can't find any more resources. Of course, not long after that, the price absolutely cratered. This is when the so-called global financial crisis occurred. This is where we had the subprime mortgage meltdown, and the whole world went into a recession. And so people lost their jobs. They stopped spending as much. They stopped driving as much. The price collapsed. And this is when I graduated right here. So this occurred a year before I graduated, and really the prospects of getting a job were quite difficult. That's actually why I ended up in Midland, Texas. It was not my first choice. I'm glad I came out here, though, in hindsight. But you can see the price absolutely cratered. But if you look at the absolute level, it was significantly lower. But if we were to come out, the price of oil was still pretty good, okay, after I came out and I graduated. So I moved out to Midland, Texas. And Midland, Texas was nice. The cost of living was not too high. The traffic was not too bad. But every year, the cost of living went up. The cost of my apartments went up. The traffic got worse. There's all these trucks on the road. It's a smaller city. And all of a sudden, it's taking a lot longer to get around across town. But it went up every year, and I would have understood that had I been kind of focused in on what the price was doing, the oil price. I was actually in a boom, and I did not necessarily know it because I just graduated and I don't really have the historical context for it. But looking back at it now, it's quite obvious. You can see the price of oil was around $110 going down to around $90, $85. This is a really good oil price right here. So this is my 5-year career with my oil company. And then I decided that, you know what, I'm going to break off and start working for myself. And that's when I founded Downhole Diagnostic. Now, unfortunately, this is also the time right here where they had these so-called price wars between the American frackers and OPEC. So OPEC historically has tried to provide some sort of a floor to the price of oil, and they will reduce their production in order to try and keep the price elevated to some degree so it doesn't go too low. But at this point in time, there was a lot of production coming on from the United States, and the market was getting oversupplied, and OPEC signaled that it was not going to save the price of oil. This was the so-called price war, but really they just let the market be oversupplied, and as a result, the price of oil collapsed. Now, this was a hard time to be starting a company. I remember when I was setting up my company, I was making that 6-page brochure, I was setting up my website, and as I was doing that for over the first several months, the price of oil was just going down and down and down. And I realized, you know what, I better go out and get some business because I might not need a website. I might not have a company if I can't get some work. So this was a major correction that occurred right here. And you can see it stabilized down here much lower, around $50, a little bit higher for certain intervals. And then you can see that we have another huge drop off. Do you remember what that was? This was that global experiment that we all participated in, whether willingly or not. This was the lockdowns, when the global governments decided that we can just flip off the economy and tell everybody to stay at home. So no kids weren't going to school. Parents weren't going to work. Everybody was just working remotely on computers. And when you're in an industry where the primary use of what you produce is transportation fuels, and nobody is transporting, well, you're going to have a major oversupply and a huge price collapse. And that is exactly what happened here. And you can see the average it came down to is $20 a barrel. But remember, this is a 1-month average on this chart. And if you were working in the United States during this point in time, you probably remember the day when the price of oil went negative. So this is an image I took on my phone, and you can see here at the beginning of the trading day, it was $17 a barrel, and it was steadily going down, and then right there at the end of close, it dropped steadily, and then it fell through the floor, and it went negative. Now, what does that mean, negative oil? Well, what that means is that you're paying, whoever had this contract was paying somebody to take the oil. So they were giving oil and money, saying, take this oil, I'll pay you money. Now, why did this happen? This was kind of a technical issue that on this particular day, this was the closing of contract. So oil traders, they buy and sell these contracts for delivery of oil. And at the end of the closing of a contract, whoever has it has to take delivery of the oil. Well, you have traders in New York City that were buying these contracts as usual, and then their attempt was to sell those contracts to somebody at the end of the day. And usually big institutional buyers come in at the end of the day to buy these contracts. But on this particular day, nobody wanted the oil because we were out of storage. All the tanks were full because the price was absolutely collapsed. People were just storing oil in tanks, and we did not have a place to put it. So these particular traders had to pay people to take the oil. So it's like, here's the oil and here's a lot of money for it. Please take it because I can't take delivery of, 100,000 barrels of oil at my New York office. So kind of an interesting situation. But the price was very depressed right down here. This was a very hard time in the industry. I remember I was happy to be working about half a day per week for several weeks in this interval right here. And a lot of people were just shutting their wells in. So that is the best way to store your oil. If your tanks are full at surface, just turn the wells off. We can store the oil downhole in the reservoir. We'll produce it another day. But eventually they let us out of our houses. The economy kind of turned back on. The money printers started printing, right? We started stimulating the economy with our fiat money, and things started to come back up. Also, there was a huge reduction in supply of oil, which helped to bring the price of that oil back up. And then we have the peak right here. This is where Russia invaded Ukraine, and we have the proxy war between kind of the West and Russia going on with sanctions on Russian oil. And of course, that put a scare to the market. When you sanction oil and you remove some supply off the market, it takes the price higher, but also just the geopolitical risk was really high right here. And of course, the war continued on, but everybody's kind of calmed down and started looking at other things. And you can see that the price is somewhere here around $80 a barrel up to this recording right here. So what I want to emphasize in this chart, though, what is very important is to look at the absolute variability of the price of oil. Okay, sometimes it can be really high and then it can swing very low. And so you always want to be prepared for those swings when the price drops. And this is why you want efficient operations. We're going to talk about that in this class. You want to understand what's happening downhole and effectively operate your well. In order to effectively operate it, you need feedback, like from diagnostic tools like a fluid level gun and a dynamometer system, to understand what is happening downhole. And the second thing that I want to mention here is that, as I mentioned at the beginning, sometimes the price of oil is high, relatively high, right? If you're getting up here around $100 a barrel, that is a very good price, and you might be more aggressive. So if you have a well that's, let's say it's not pumped off, and you're running the well as fast as you can, you're pushing your equipment, but maybe you still have fluid above the pump. Well, if you're in this sort of condition, you might consider maybe we actually push it even harder. Okay, we expect that we're going to have more failures as a result, but the incremental increase in production is more than going to justify that because of the high price of oil. Other times you might be in a depressed commodity price. And during these instances right here, people don't want to spend money. And so optimization at this point in time can mean that we're going to be more gentle with our well. And sometimes optimization, as we see down in here, when the price was severely depressed, optimization for a lot of wells here was turn them off. That was optimization. Don't sell our oil at that low of a price. Let it rebound to a more reasonable price and we'll sell it at that point. So keep in mind, we're in a very volatile industry and you have to kind of roll ups and downs. And of course, you understand that a lot of people love the oil industry when it's booming because they get lots of pay, and then it busts and then you don't have a job. So that is one of the difficult parts of our industry. So two other factors that can cause wild variations in the price of oil are really just the projections of future economics of a certain project. The first is politics, because you have certain people that believe that all oil should be shut down. And usually as a result of these people's action, though, it causes the price of oil to go up, right? As long as they're not affecting your particular production wherever your wells are. So if these people want to ban fracking in the United Kingdom, well, that does not hurt me out here in the Permian Basin. Actually, that's going to increase the price of oil for me because people still want oil and they're just going to limit the amount of production that comes from that certain jurisdiction. But certainly politics plays a role in economics of oil and also affecting the price. Typically, though, it's going to cause the price to go up. Now, also, that is the same here between OPEC. OPEC is another factor that you have to consider. Of course, we have no control over this sort of thing. But as I discussed in 2014, okay, OPEC is usually there kind of providing a floor for the market. So if the price gets too low, they will voluntarily cut back some production to try and stabilize the price so that we don't collapse our industry and all go bankrupt. But sometimes they decide to not do that. So this is kind of a cartoon from 2014 that's showing the standoff here between OPEC and the US frackers. So as the US frackers continue to bring more and more production online from these horizontal wells, they were bringing more onto the market. The price was going down. OPEC was kind of stabilizing that price, which only meant that the price didn't go down and U.S. frackers started drilling more. And eventually, OPEC decided, you know what, we're not going to stabilize the price. Let's just let it go free market. And what it did was it dropped precipitously. That was in 2014 when they almost took my company down, which I had just started in the process, because they really impacted the amount of activity that was happening out here. But these huge price swings cause lots of booms and busts. So here's some images I took during the pandemic. So shale boom, shale bust. Banks get tough on shale loans as fracking forecast flop. And this was actually a big problem where there was big promises of how much oil was going to be produced from some of these unconventional shale wells that did not pan out. And so companies have gotten better at deploying their capital and not overextending themselves since then. But is the U.S. shale facing an unmitigated disaster? In 2020, the year of oil bankruptcies. And so the important thing about what we're just discussing here is the price goes up, the price goes down. You don't want to get wiped out when the price busts. So it's always good to be operating efficiently. That's what we're going to be talking about in this course. So let me finish off with a little bit of Soviet propaganda. So my wife is from Russia, which I thought was spicy. That became a little extra spicy when they invaded Ukraine and some of the politics of things going on. You know, I go to Russia once or twice a year and I've been doing that for the last 6 years. Don't believe everything you hear about it. It is a great country. It is great people. But let me end with this Soviet propaganda to get you inspired to go on to section 2. So skori vi ponedelnik I snova na robotu. That means I can't wait for Monday to come so I can go back to work. And with that, my friend, I hope you have that same feeling. Let's go ahead and jump over to section 2.